My father blocked the entrance with one hand on the door and said, "Family only, Karen." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I had just driven 10 hours from Fort Hood, Texas to Tulsa, Oklahoma. My back hurt. My eyes felt gritty from staring at Interstate 35 most of the day. I'd stopped twice for coffee and once for gas outside Ardmore. The whole trip had taken longer than expected because of road construction near Oklahoma City. And now my father was standing in front of me like a nightclub bouncer. "Dad, what?" He didn't smile. Inside the ballroom I could hear music playing, guests were laughing, glasses clinked. Somebody was testing a microphone. My younger sister Brittany's wedding was already underway. Dad folded his arms. They had to make some adjustments with the guest list. I stared at him. "What adjustments? There's not enough room." I looked past him. There were empty chairs. Not one or two. Several. My stomach dropped. "Dad," he sighed heavily like I was the one making things difficult. "You can watch the live stream." I still remember those exact words. Not because they were especially cruel, because of how casually he said them. Like he was suggesting I catch a football game on television. Just then a couple I'd never seen before walked past us. Dad stepped aside and let them enter. The woman smiled politely at me. "Beautiful venue, isn't it?" I couldn't even answer. Behind my father I spotted my mother near the reception area. Linda Mitchell, 71 years old. She looked directly at me, then looked away. That hurt more than anything Dad said. Because at that moment I knew. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. Weeks ago, maybe months. Nobody had forgotten to add my name. Nobody had run out of seats. They simply didn't want me there. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. For a few seconds I considered pushing past him, demanding answers, creating a scene. I had every right to. Instead I looked at my father and nodded. "Got it." He seemed relieved. Like he'd expected an argument. I turned around and walked back toward the parking lot. The late afternoon sun felt hotter than before. My dress shoes clicked against the pavement. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called my name. Nobody came after me. That part stayed with me for a long time. I sat in my truck for nearly 15 minutes before starting the engine. My phone buzzed. A notification from the wedding livestream. The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and stared through the windshield. 47 years old. Master Sergeant in the Army. 24 years of service. I've managed supply operations during hurricanes. Handled emergency deployments. Led soldiers twice my size. Yet somehow one sentence from my father still made me feel like a little girl standing outside a locked door. The drive back to Texas was quiet. I crossed the Oklahoma state line after dark. Somewhere south of Norman I stopped at a Buc-ee's. If you've ever been to one, you know they're impossible to miss. Huge parking lot. Bright lights. More snacks than any human needs. I bought a brisket sandwich and a bottle of water. The cashier smiled. Long trip. Something like that. Back in my truck I watched people come and go. Families. Couples. Grandparents with grandchildren. Normal lives. Normal relationships. The kind I'd spent years pretending I had. The truth was more complicated. Brittany had always been the favorite. Not in obvious ways. My parents would never admit it. But everybody knew. When we were kids in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, Brittany got away with everything. Missed curfew. No big deal. Failed a class. Teacher's fault. Needed money. Mom and Dad found it somehow. Meanwhile, expectations followed me everywhere. Good grades. Part-time job. Responsible choices. When I joined the Army at 23, my father called it the practical option. When Brittany quit 3 jobs in 2 years, he praised her for finding herself. I learned early that approval wasn't something freely given in my family. It had to be earned. Over and over. And even then, it never lasted. Around midnight, I checked into a Hampton Inn outside Denton, Texas. The woman at the front desk handed me a room key. "Traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Safe travels." Simple words. Yet somehow kinder than anything I'd heard from my family all day. Inside the room, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed. My phone showed dozens of wedding photos already being posted online. Brittany smiling. Dad smiling. Mom smiling. Everyone smiling. Like I had never existed. I should have turned it off. Instead, I watched. Not because I enjoyed it. Because part of me still hoped I'd find evidence this had all been a misunderstanding. I didn't. At 2 a.m, I finally fell asleep. The next few days passed in a blur. Work helped. Army logistics leaves little time for self-pity. Monday morning I was back on base reviewing inventory reports. Tuesday I attended a planning meeting. Wednesday, I supervised a training exercise. Life moved forward, at least on the surface. Then Friday morning arrived. I was sitting at my kitchen table before work, coffee in one hand, local news playing softly on television. My phone rang. Mom. I stared at the screen. Part of me expected an apology, maybe an explanation, something, anything. After 4 rings, I answered. Hello? Her voice sounded irritated, not guilty, not embarrassed, irritated. Karen, what happened to the card? I frowned. What card? The Visa. Suddenly I knew exactly why she was calling. The credit card account I'd opened years ago. The one where Mom was an authorized user. The card I'd frozen 3 days earlier while driving back from Tulsa. You stopped it, she said. Yes, silence. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Well, you need to turn it back on. The wedding balance still hasn't been paid. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No apology. No mention of the wedding. No acknowledgement of what happened. Just money. Always money. My mother lowered her voice. Karen, there are $35,000 in outstanding expenses. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, a lawn crew was trimming hedges across the street. The ordinary sound felt strangely comforting. Because what I was hearing on the phone was anything but ordinary. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. I felt curious. Curious about how long they'd expected this arrangement to continue. Curious about how much they thought they could take. Most of all, curious about what would happen when I finally said no. I laughed. Not because anything about the situation was funny. Because I honestly didn't know what else to do. My mother was sitting there on the phone talking about a $35,000 wedding balance, as if the biggest problem in our relationship was a declined credit card. Karen, she said. I rubbed my forehead. Mom, are you serious right now? What does that mean? It means you haven't said one word about what happened at the wedding. A pause. Then she sighed. The kind of sigh she'd used my entire life whenever she wanted me to feel unreasonable. We're not talking about that. No, that's exactly what we're talking about. Another pause. Then came the familiar shift. The victim act. Your father was under a lot of stress. I stared at the coffee mug sitting on my kitchen table. Same answer. Different year. Different problem. Always somebody else's fault. Always somebody else's stress. Never accountability. What about you? I asked. What about me? You saw it happen. Karen! No, you saw it happen. Her voice hardened. That isn't why I'm calling. Of course it wasn't. I should have known better. The wedding wasn't why she called. The humiliation wasn't why she called. The fact that her oldest daughter drove 10 hours only to be turned away wasn't why she called. She called because money was involved. When I didn't respond, she continued. We have vendors waiting. The family. I almost laughed again. The family. Interesting choice of words. Apparently I wasn't family enough to attend the wedding, but I was family enough to pay for it. Mom, I'm heading to work. So you'll reactivate the card. No. Silence. Then, Karen, don't be selfish. The line went dead a few seconds later. Not because I hung up, because she did. I sat there staring at my phone. For years, that conversation would have ruined my day. This time it didn't. It bothered me. It hurt. But something felt different. Like a switch had finally flipped. Maybe because I was tired. Maybe because turning 50 was getting closer than 40. Or maybe because being publicly rejected had stripped away the last illusion I was holding on to. Whatever the reason, I wasn't interested in playing my usual role anymore. That evening after work, I pulled out a small fireproof box from my bedroom closet. Inside were old financial records, tax returns, insurance documents, account statements, the boring paperwork of adult life. I found the credit card file and carried it to the kitchen. Then I started reviewing everything. The card had originally been opened 6 years earlier, back when my father underwent bypass surgery. Their insurance covered most of it, but unexpected expenses piled up. Hotel stays, prescriptions, follow-up appointments. At the time, helping felt natural. My parents needed support. I was financially stable. End of story. I added Mom as an authorized user. Emergency situations only. That had been the agreement. Or at least I thought it had. Looking back, things changed gradually. So gradually I barely noticed. First, it was a grocery purchase. Then a utility bill. Then a furniture payment. Each charge came with an explanation. Just this once. We'll pay you back. Things are tight right now. You know how expensive everything is. The excuses always sounded reasonable. Then one day the explanations stopped altogether. The charges simply appeared, month after month, year after year. I started noticing patterns while reviewing statements. Restaurants, home improvement stores, department stores. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to slowly blur the line between help and dependence. I was halfway through a stack of statements when my phone buzzed. A text message from Brittany. The first communication I'd received from her since the wedding. For a moment, I almost ignored it. Then curiosity won. The message read, "Mom says you're refusing to pay the wedding vendors." I stared at the screen. No greeting, no apology, nothing. Just an accusation. I typed 3 different responses before deleting them all. Eventually, I settled on something simple. "You threw me out of your wedding." Her reply came less than a minute later. "You weren't thrown out." I laughed. Again. Apparently, laughter had become my body's automatic response to absurdity. I set the phone down and went to bed. The next morning was Saturday. I spent most of it doing ordinary things. Laundry, grocery shopping, changing the air filter in my truck. The kind of routine tasks that somehow become comforting during stressful periods. Around noon, I stopped at a diner near Killeen. Nothing fancy, just coffee and a turkey sandwich. While I was eating, my phone buzzed again. This time it was an email. Subject line, "Wedding payment summary." I opened it expecting another demand. Instead, I found an attached spreadsheet listing vendor balances. Flowers, catering, photography, venue upgrades, luxury transportation, hotel blocks. The total came to just over $35,000. I scrolled through the numbers. Then something caught my attention. The sender. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't Brittany. It was someone named Ashley Monroe. I recognized the name after a second. One of Brittany's bridesmaids. Why would she send this to me? At the bottom of the email was a short message. "Karen, you deserve to know the truth. Check the attachment labeled Planning Group." That was it. Nothing more. My pulse quickened. I opened the second file. It contained screenshots, dozens of them. Text messages from a wedding planning group chat. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Then I started reading. The messages were dated months earlier, long before the wedding, long before my invitation arrived. One message came from Brittany. "Don't invite Karen yet." Another, "She's stationed in Texas anyway." Then a reply from my mother. "We still need help with expenses." A few lines later came the message that made my stomach turn. "Invite Karen, we still need her card." Several laughing emojis followed. One from Brittany, one from Mom, one from another bridesmaid. I kept reading. The conversation continued for pages. Not one person defended me. Not one person objected. To them, I wasn't a sister. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even a guest. I was a payment method. I closed the laptop and walked outside. The Texas heat hit me immediately. For several minutes, I simply stood in my driveway. A neighbor across the street waved. I waved back automatically. Then I sat on the tailgate of my truck and stared at nothing. I've faced difficult things in life. Army deployments, divorce, death of friends, serious setbacks. But betrayal from family carries a unique kind of pain. Because you keep looking for a misunderstanding long after the evidence is staring you in the face. Part of me still wanted to believe there was another explanation. A better explanation. But there wasn't. The screenshots were real. The dates were real. The jokes were real. And for the first time, I understood something important. The wedding wasn't the betrayal. The wedding was simply the moment I finally noticed it. That evening, I logged into the credit card account. One by one, I removed every authorized user. Then I changed passwords, updated security settings, added additional verification. It took less than 10 minutes. 6 years of financial access disappeared with a few clicks. Afterward, I sat quietly at my desk. Not triumphant, not angry, just tired. Then a new email notification appeared. The sender was Ashley again. This one contained only a single sentence. "There's more you don't know." The email sat in my inbox for almost an hour before I opened it. "There's more you don't know." That was all Ashley had written. No explanation. No details. Just enough to make my stomach tighten. I finally clicked reply. "Ashley, I'm listening." About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer. That day I did. "Karen." The voice sounded nervous. "Yes, this is Ashley." I leaned back in my chair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. "I should have contacted you sooner." "Why now?" "Because what they did wasn't right." Simple words. But they carried weight. I appreciated that she didn't immediately launch into excuses. No speeches, no attempts to defend anyone. Just honesty. For the next 40 minutes, Ashley told me things I wish I'd never heard, and things I desperately needed to hear. The wedding planning group hadn't just joked about using my credit card. Apparently, my parents and Brittany had been telling relatives a completely different story. According to them, I had volunteered to pay for the wedding months earlier. Not contribute. Not help. Pay for it. The whole thing. I felt my chest tighten. What? I know, Ashley said quietly. Who did they tell? Pretty much everybody. I stood and walked into the kitchen. The room suddenly felt too small. You're saying my family believes I promised $35,000? Yes. And now they think I backed out? Yes. I closed my eyes. For the first time since the wedding, genuine anger started replacing the hurt. Not because of the money, because of the lie. A lie designed to make me look selfish while making them look like victims. It was smart in a twisted way. People love simple stories. Responsible daughter promises help. Responsible daughter refuses help. End of story. Nobody asks questions. Nobody investigates. Nobody wants complications, Ashley continued. Some people actually feel sorry for your parents. I laughed once. A short, humorless sound. Of course they do. That evening I sat at my dining room table long after sunset. The house was quiet. The television stayed off. I just sat there thinking. Part of me wanted to call everyone. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins. Tell them the truth. Defend myself. But another part of me was exhausted. For 47 years I'd been defending myself, explaining myself, trying to earn fairness. Maybe I was finally tired of performing. The next week brought exactly what Ashley predicted. Phone calls, text messages, messages on Facebook. Not from everyone, but enough. One cousin asked if I was having financial problems. Another wanted to know why I'd abandoned Brittany. An aunt from Missouri left a voicemail saying, "Your parents are heartbroken." Interesting. Nobody seemed worried about me. One evening, my Uncle Dennis called. We'd always gotten along reasonably well. I hoped maybe he'd be different. He wasn't. Karen, I don't understand why you're doing this. Doing what? Embarrassing your parents. I nearly dropped the phone. Embarrassing them? Well, they're struggling. I looked around my kitchen. The conversation felt surreal. Dennis, did anyone tell you they threw me out of the wedding? A pause. Then, they said there was confusion. Confusion. That was a new one. Apparently the story evolved depending on the audience. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. Afterward, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I made a decision. No more guessing. No more assumptions. I wanted facts. Every single one. The following Saturday, I logged into the credit card account and started digging deeper. Not just wedding expenses, everything. Every statement from the past 2 years. What I found surprised me. And not in a good way. The wedding wasn't the biggest issue. Not even close. It was simply the most recent one. As I reviewed, transactions patterns emerged. Frequent shopping trips, weekend getaways, luxury purchases, expenses that clearly had nothing to do with emergencies. One charge stood out immediately. $873 at a high-end spa in Oklahoma City. Another showed over $1,000 spent at a casino resort. Then there were designer handbags, jewelry stores, boutique clothing shops. I kept scrolling. The numbers kept growing. Months of small indulgences, thousands of dollars I never questioned because I trusted my parents. The realization was painful, not because of the amount, because trust had been treated like a resource to consume. I created folders, downloaded statements, saved receipts, organized everything. Army habits die hard. By Sunday afternoon, my dining room looked like a tax accountant's office. Paper everywhere, highlighted documents, sticky notes, spreadsheets. I wasn't planning revenge, at least not yet. I simply wanted clarity. But clarity has a way of changing people, especially when it reveals things you've spent years refusing to see. Late Sunday evening, I came across a receipt that made me laugh out loud. Actually laugh. The first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. Wedding decorations, custom imported candles. $612. For candles. I read the item description twice, then 3 times. $600. For something designed to melt. The absurdity broke through all the anger for a moment. I imagined my practical grandfather seeing that receipt. The man survived the Great Depression. He would have fainted. The next morning, I carried a folder of documents to work. Not because I needed them there, because I couldn't stop thinking about them. During lunch, I sat alone outside near the motor pool. Texas sun, warm breeze, forklifts moving in the distance, normal military life. My phone buzzed. A text from Brittany. First message in nearly a week. It read, "You need to stop talking to people." I stared at it. Interesting. I hadn't been talking to anyone, which meant somebody else had. Probably Ashley. Maybe others. I replied. "I'm not talking, I'm listening." No response came back. That silence told me more than any argument could. The following weeks settled into an uneasy routine. Work. Home. Phone calls from relatives. More paperwork. More discoveries. Some nights I slept fine. Others I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering whether exposing everything would make me any better than they were. Wondering whether I should simply walk away. Start over. Forget all of it. The temptation was real. But every time I considered it, another lie surfaced. Another distorted story. Another attempt to paint me as the villain. Eventually I understood something. Staying silent wasn't creating peace. It was protecting the people who caused the damage. Then, on a humid afternoon in August, a thick white envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was an invitation. Labor Day weekend. Mitchell family reunion. Broken Arrow Community Center. Nearly every branch of the family would be there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandchildren. More than 60 relatives. At the bottom of the invitation, someone had handwritten a note. "Hope you can make it. Family is important." I sat at the kitchen table staring at those words. Family is important. For several minutes, I considered throwing the invitation in the trash. That would have been easier. Safer. Probably healthier. Instead, I looked across the room at the neatly organized folders stacked on my desk. Every receipt, every statement, every screenshot, every lie. And for the first time, a different possibility entered my mind. Maybe the reunion wasn't a problem. Maybe it was an opportunity. Labor Day weekend arrived faster than I expected. For 2 weeks, I went back and forth about attending the reunion. One day, I'd decide to stay home. The next day, I'd decide to go. Then I'd change my mind again. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. The Army cured me of that years ago. What worried me was something else. Once certain words are spoken, you can't take them back. Once family secrets become public, they stay public. Part of me still hoped somebody would do the right thing before it came to that. Nobody did. So on Saturday morning, I loaded a cardboard file box into my truck and headed north. The drive from Fort Hood to Broken Arrow felt different from the drive to Brittany's wedding. That trip had been filled with hope. This one was filled with certainty. Not certainty about the outcome. Certainty about the facts. And facts are powerful things. The reunion was being held at a community center near a public park I'd visited as a kid. When I pulled into the parking lot, dozens of vehicles were already there. Pickup trucks, SUVs, minivans, a few campers. Kids were running around outside. Some relatives were grilling hamburgers. Others sat beneath folding canopies trying to escape the Oklahoma heat. For a moment I stayed inside my truck, watching, thinking. Then I grabbed the file box and got out. The first person I saw was my cousin Rachel. She spotted me immediately. Her smile faded, not completely. Just enough for me to notice. That pretty much set the tone for the afternoon. People were polite, but distant, like they weren't entirely sure what to do with me. I understood why. Most of them had only heard one version of events. As far as they knew, I was the daughter who abandoned her family over money. I spent the first hour moving through small conversations. Weather. Work. Grandkids. Football season. Normal family gathering topics. But underneath every conversation, I could feel it. The curiosity. The judgment. The uncertainty. Eventually, Uncle Dennis approached, carrying a paper plate loaded with barbecue. "Karen." "Hi, Dennis." He shifted awkwardly. "I hope things get worked out." There it was again. The assumption. Not what happened. Not what went wrong. Just the expectation that I should somehow fix it. I smiled politely. "Me too." Around 3 o'clock, the entire family gathered inside the community hall for announcements and photographs. Long folding tables filled the room. Children chased each other between chairs. Older relatives settled into conversations. The atmosphere felt normal, at least on the surface. Then my father stood up, and I immediately knew where this was going. Robert Mitchell loved an audience. Always had. He tapped a spoon against a glass. The room gradually quieted. Before we continue, he said, "I'd like to say something." My stomach tightened. Several people glanced toward me. Not a good sign. Dad cleared his throat. "This family has always supported one another." "Here we go," he continued. Unfortunately, that support hasn't always been returned. The room became very still. Nobody was eating anymore. Nobody was talking. Everybody understood exactly who he meant. I looked toward my mother. She sat beside him silently, not surprised, not uncomfortable, prepared. This had been planned. Just like the wedding. Dad shook his head sadly. The performance was impressive. I never thought I'd see the day one of my own children would abandon this family. A few relatives nodded sympathetically. I couldn't believe it. Even now, even after everything, he was still doing it, still lying, still counting on my silence. Then he said something that changed everything. After everything we've sacrificed, that sentence hit me harder than I expected. Because suddenly I wasn't thinking about the wedding, or the credit card, or the lies. I was thinking about every birthday I'd missed while deployed, every holiday spent overseas, every overtime shift, every lonely apartment, every sacrifice I'd actually made. And something inside me finally settled. The hesitation disappeared. I stood up. The scraping sound of my chair echoed across the room. Dad stopped talking. Everyone turned toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I picked up the file box, walked to the front of the room, and placed it on a table. The sound of cardboard hitting wood seemed surprisingly loud. My father frowned. "What are you doing?" I looked around the room. At aunts, uncles, cousins, people I'd known my entire life. Then I answered, "Something I should have done a long time ago." The room fell silent. I opened the box, removed the first folder, and began. No speeches, no yelling, no dramatic accusations, just facts, dates, statements, documents, receipts. I explained how the credit card account started after Dad's surgery, how Mom became an authorized user, how the agreement was supposed to be temporary. Then I showed the spending records, years of them, one by one. The room grew quieter with every page. I could see expressions changing. Confusion, concern, shock. Uncle Dennis took a set of statements and began reading. His eyebrows rose immediately. Aunt Carol leaned closer. Someone whispered, "Are these real?" I answered calmly. "They came directly from the bank." Dad tried interrupting. "That's not the point." I turned toward him. "No, it's exactly the point." Then I revealed the wedding documents. The unpaid balances, the spending breakdowns, the luxury purchases, the spa charges, the casino expenses, the designer handbags. My mother looked pale. Brittany wasn't there. For the first time in my life, I was grateful for that. Then came the final folder. The screenshots. The wedding planning messages. The room became so quiet I could hear an air conditioner running somewhere behind me. I handed copies to the relatives nearest the front. Within seconds, papers began moving from table to table. People read silently. Eyes widened. Faces changed. Then someone read the message out loud. "Invite Karen, we still need her card." Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody defended it. Nobody explained it away. Because there was nothing to explain. The words spoke for themselves. My father looked trapped. My mother stared at the floor. For the first time, neither of them had a script. Then came the moment nobody expected, including me. My Uncle Ray adjusted his glasses and looked at one of the receipts. "Hold on." The room turned toward him. He held up a page. $600 for candles. Nobody answered. Uncle Ray looked genuinely confused. Candles. A few people chuckled. Then more. Then the entire room erupted. Not cruel laughter. Disbelieving laughter. The kind that happens when something becomes too ridiculous to ignore. "Candles," he repeated. "Did they cure diseases?" Even I laughed. The tension cracked instantly. And once it cracked, everything changed. People started asking questions. Real questions. Not accusations. Questions. Dad tried speaking twice. Nobody listened. For years, he'd controlled the narrative. Now the documents were doing the talking. And documents don't care about feelings. An hour later, small groups of relatives were still discussing what they'd learned. Some approached me quietly. Others apologized. A few admitted they'd believed the stories. I appreciated the honesty. More than that, I appreciated finally being heard. As the reunion began winding down, I carried the file box back to my truck. Lighter, somehow. Not because the box weighed less. Because I did. For months, I'd been carrying their version of the story. Now everyone had seen mine. And for the first time since the wedding, I felt something close to peace. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The weeks afterward would prove that truth can set you free. But first, it tends to make people very uncomfortable. I expected to feel victorious after the reunion. I didn't. What I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that doesn't go away with a good night's sleep. For months, I'd been carrying around anger, confusion, disappointment, and guilt. Standing up for myself had been necessary, but it wasn't magical. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. Family problems don't wrap themselves up neatly just because the truth comes out. The Monday after Labor Day, I was back at Fort Hood. Back to inventory reports, back to meetings, back to ordinary routines. The world kept moving. That's one thing I've learned over the years. No matter how dramatic something feels in the moment, most people still have to wake up, go to work, buy groceries, and pay bills the next morning. The first few days were surprisingly quiet. No angry calls, no dramatic messages, no social media battles, just silence. Then the apologies started. Not all at once, one at a time. My cousin Rachel called first. "I owe you an apology." I was standing in line at a pharmacy when she said it. Simple, direct. No excuses, no qualifications, just an apology. It meant more than she probably realized. A few days later, Uncle Dennis called. That conversation lasted nearly an hour. He admitted he'd believed my parents, admitted he'd never asked questions because he assumed there was nothing to question. I should have listened before judging. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it. Not because I needed validation, but because accountability matters. The truth is, admitting you're wrong isn't easy. Especially after 60 years of believing you're a good judge of character. Over the next several weeks, more relatives reached out. Some apologized. Some asked questions. Some simply wanted to reconnect. Interestingly, the relationships that survived became stronger than they'd ever been. Without the family myths, without the pressure, without pretending everything was fine, real relationships finally had room to breathe. Not everyone responded that way. My father didn't. At least not at first. As far as I could tell, he was furious. According to family members, he spent weeks blaming everyone except himself. The bank, the economy, the wedding vendors, me, mostly me. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was my own reaction. For once, I wasn't interested in defending myself. I wasn't interested in winning. I wasn't interested in changing his mind. I had spent decades chasing approval that never seemed to arrive. Now I simply didn't have the energy anymore. And honestly, that felt wonderful. Around that time, I started doing something I'd neglected for years. Living my own life. It sounds obvious. But when you're the responsible person in a family, your life slowly fills up with other people's emergencies. Their bills, their mistakes, their problems, their crises. Before long, you barely notice how much space they've occupied. That fall, I started spending more time with friends from the military. A group of us took a weekend trip to the Texas Hill Country. Nothing fancy. Just good food, live music, and conversations that didn't revolve around family drama. One evening, we sat outside a small restaurant near Fredericksburg. The sun was setting. People were laughing. A local band was playing old country songs. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary evening, I realized something. I hadn't thought about the wedding all day. Not once. It felt like a milestone. Small, but important. Healing rarely arrives with a grand announcement. Usually it sneaks in quietly when you're paying attention to something else. By November, the financial side of things was completely resolved. The card account remained closed to everyone except me. No more surprise charges, no more emergency requests, no more uncomfortable conversations. The silence felt strange at first, then peaceful. Thanksgiving came and went. For the first time in my adult life, I spent the holiday exactly how I wanted. No guilt. No obligations, no walking on eggshells, just a few close friends, too much food, and a football game on television. I can't remember who won. I remember being happy. Then Christmas arrived. A few days before the holiday, I was wrapping gifts in my living room when my phone rang. "Mom?" I stared at the screen. The same way I'd stared at it months earlier. Only this time felt different. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "Karen, I owe you an apology." I sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt very quiet. My mother wasn't a person who apologized. At least not easily. Certainly not first. "I handled things badly," she continued. "Very badly." I didn't interrupt. Partly because I was listening. Partly because I was afraid the moment might disappear if I moved too quickly. She spoke for several minutes, not perfectly, not dramatically. She didn't suddenly transform into a different person. But she was honest. More honest than I'd heard her be in years. Eventually, she said something that stayed with me. "You deserved better." 4 simple words. Nothing could undo the wedding. Nothing could undo years of favoritism. Nothing could erase the hurt. But hearing those words mattered. A lot. When the conversation ended, I sat quietly for a long time. looking at the Christmas tree in the corner of the room, thinking, not about revenge, not about justice, not even about forgiveness. I was thinking about freedom, because that's what had really changed. The day I stopped paying wasn't the day I punished my family. It was the day I stopped funding my own mistreatment. That's an important distinction. For years, I thought keeping peace required sacrifice. What I eventually learned was that healthy relationships don't require one person to carry everyone else. They don't require constant rescue missions. And they certainly don't require you to purchase your place in the family. My parents and I still aren't perfect. We probably never will be. Some wounds heal slowly. Some leave scars. That's life. But these days when I look in the mirror, I see someone who finally drew a line. Someone who finally respected herself enough to say no. And honestly, that's worth more than $35,000. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, you probably understand exactly what I mean. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't helping people. It's realizing when helping has turned into enabling. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. If any part of it felt familiar, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've learned a difficult lesson about family boundaries or self-respect, you're certainly not alone. The end.